Welcome to Horror Echo. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from and the time. Now, relax and join me on a journey into the unknown. The Wedding Ghosts. The moon hung high above the quiet countryside, casting a pale light over the small, ancient church nestled at the edge of a forgotten village. It had been a dream wedding, the kind that makes you believe in fairy tales. The church, with its centuries-old stone walls, had been freshly decorated with white flowers and glistening ribbons. The guests gathered in hushed excitement, eager to witness the union of Grace and Thomas, two souls destined to be together for eternity. But what should have been the happiest day of their lives quickly turned into something far darker. As the ceremony began, an eerie chill filled the air. At first, no one noticed. The wedding vows were exchanged, the rings slid onto fingers, and the couple shared their first kiss as husband and wife. Laughter echoed, and champagne flowed, as the newlyweds led their guests into the reception hall. Yet, in the corner of the church, behind the tall wooden doors, a shadow lingered, barely noticeable, but undeniably present. Grace felt a strange weight on her chest, a sudden unease that she couldn't shake. It wasn't the nerves typical of a wedding day, but something colder, something deeper. Her gaze wandered toward the corner of the room where the shadow seemed to twitch, shifting unnaturally as if it were alive. "Are you okay?" Thomas asked, his hand resting on her shoulder, pulling her back into the moment. "I don't know," she whispered, feeling a chill run down her spine. "It feels like something is watching us." At first, Thomas brushed it off, trying to comfort her, but the unease lingered, growing with every passing minute. The night wore on, and soon, the reception was in full swing, but Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the clock struck midnight, the room grew colder. The guests began to notice strange occurrences. Glasses moved by themselves, tables rattled as though touched by unseen hands, and flickering lights cast unsettling shadows on the walls. Whispers echoed through the air, though no one could identify the source. Then, one by one, the guests began to notice something else. In the reflection of the large mirrors that lined the reception hall, they saw figures standing behind them, figures that weren't there in reality. A bride, a groom, and a third, much older figure, dressed in tattered clothing, their face a blur of sorrow and rage. The whispers grew louder, and suddenly, the room seemed to close in on itself. Grace spun around, her heart pounding in her chest, only to find no one behind her. But when she looked back into the mirror, there they were. The bride, the groom, and the figure with hollow eyes, staring back at her with a malevolent intensity. "Thomas," she screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the growing cacophony of whispers and laughter that seemed to fill the air, a cold, mocking sound that sent chills deep into her soul. And then, the music stopped. A strange, unnatural silence fell over the room, and all the guests turned to face the newlyweds. Thomas looked bewildered, his face pale as he slowly turned to Grace. But something was different about him. His eyes were vacant, as though the life had been drained from him. "Thomas?" Grace called, her voice trembling. But he didn't respond. Instead, his lips parted, but the words that came out were not his own. "You shouldn't have come," the voice hissed, its tone dark and twisted. "This is our day. You are not welcome." A cold wind swept through the hall, slamming the doors shut with a deafening bang. The shadows in the room stretched, twisting into grotesque shapes, and the figures in the mirrors began to move, closing in on Grace and Thomas. Who are you?" Grace whispered, backing away from the figure that now emerged from the shadows. It was the woman in the tattered wedding dress, her face twisted in a grotesque smile. I am the bride, she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. And you are my replacement. The room seemed to pulse with energy, the very air alive with anger and sorrow. Grace stumbled back, her heart racing. She looked at Thomas, but his face was completely different now, pale, hollow, lifeless, as though he were no longer human. The figure in the tattered dress raised a skeletal hand, pointing directly at Grace. You will join us, the voice growled, whether you wish it or not. As Grace screamed, she was pulled toward the center of the room, her feet moving of their own accord. The shadows enveloped her, and the whispers turned into a maddening roar. The wedding bells that had once celebrated love now tolled for something much darker. And as the bell rang one final time, Grace was gone. Vanished into the shadows, her spirit now bound to the church that had witnessed her wedding, but not her death. The guests never spoke of that night again, but the village never forgot. The church still stands, its doors always locked, its windows forever clouded with fog. On moonlit nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint sound of wedding bells, and the whispers of the bride and groom who never left. The whispers never truly stopped. Not in the village. Not in the church. Not even in the hearts of the few who dared to speak of that night. It was as though the spirits had woven themselves into the very fabric of the place, and over time, the church became a ghost story, a tale passed from generation to generation. But some stories, no matter how many years have passed, have a way of clawing their way back into the light. 2 years later, on a crisp autumn evening, a group of young friends, curious and daring, decided to visit the abandoned church. It was known that strange things happened around the church, but no one had dared step inside for years. The village had grown used to the rumors, to the idea that the spirits of Grace and Thomas still roamed the old walls, but no one truly believed. Or at least, that's what they thought. Ellie, the leader of the group, was determined to uncover the truth. We've got to go inside tonight, she said, her eyes gleaming with a mix of fear and excitement. It's just a stupid story. We'll prove it, and then we can laugh about it tomorrow. Her friends hesitated. Jack, a practical guy, rubbed the back of his neck nervously. I don't know, Ellie. I've heard things. People who went in there, they came out different. Like something followed them. Oh, stop being such a coward, Ellie teased. You're just scared of a few old legends. Let's go. It'll be fun. Reluctantly, the others followed her to the church, their flashlights piercing the darkness as they walked along the narrow path leading to the heavy, weathered doors. As they reached the entrance, the chill in the air seemed to intensify. Ellie pushed open the door with a creak that echoed through the empty village. Inside, the church was a ruin. The once glistening pews were rotting, and the altar was covered in thick layers of dust. Cobwebs hung from the rafters like ghostly veils, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. But despite the eerie atmosphere, Ellie's resolve didn't waver. We'll take some pictures, she said, her voice echoing in the silence. It'll be like a haunted house tour. Ghosts aren't real anyway, right? Her friends, though uneasy, nodded. They spread out, taking photos of the decaying structure, the old stained glass windows, and the strange, weathered candles still resting in the corners. But as Ellie moved toward the altar, she stopped. Her flashlight beam froze on something strange. There, near the steps leading up to the altar, was a figure. It was faint at first, a blurry outline, but as her flashlight steadied, the figure became clearer. A woman in a wedding dress, tattered, stained with what looked like blood, and her face obscured by dark, tangled hair. Ellie's heart raced as she tried to step forward, but the woman vanished, like smoke drifting through the air. What the hell was that? Jack asked, his voice shaking as he joined her by the altar. Ellie was silent, her eyes wide with disbelief. Did you see that? It was her. The bride. Grace. The air around them grew colder, and a low, distant moan echoed through the walls. The sound was followed by the unmistakable sound of wedding bells, slow, deliberate, like they were being struck by an invisible hand. The floor beneath their feet vibrated slightly, and the temperature plummeted, causing their breath to fog in the air. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the church. The group turned sharply, but the church was empty. Did you hear that? Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. Before anyone could respond, a low, guttural laugh filled the room. It was a chilling sound, one that made their blood run cold. And then, the doors slammed shut behind them with an explosion of sound, trapping them inside. The shadows in the corners of the church seemed to twist and move, and from the darkness, figures began to emerge, shapes that were human, but distorted, their eyes hollow, their bodies decaying. "Welcome," a voice whispered, but it was not from any of the figures in the room. It was a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating off the crumbling walls. "Welcome to our wedding, guests." The figures began to move toward them, their steps slow and deliberate, like they were relishing the moment. Ellie tried to move, but her body was frozen in place, as though the very air around her had thickened, turning to stone. And then, the figure of the bride appeared again, Grace. She was no longer just a shadow, but a solid form, her dress hanging in tatters, her face twisted in agony. She reached toward Ellie with outstretched hands. "You should have never come," Grace hissed, her voice like nails scraping on glass. "This place is ours. And now, you will stay." The friends tried to run, but the church seemed to stretch endlessly, the doors impossibly far away, no matter how fast they ran. Every step they took led them deeper into the suffocating darkness, and all around them, they could hear the wedding bells tolling louder and louder, as though the church itself was alive, feeding on their fear. One by one, they began to vanish into the shadows. Jack disappeared first, his scream echoing faintly as if swallowed by the very walls. Then, Lily. And soon, only Ellie remained. She stumbled through the cold, her heart pounding in her chest, but the ghostly figures were closing in on her, their voices whispering her name. And then, she saw it. The mirror. It was large, framed in gold, and the surface was cracked, yet still intact. As she approached, her reflection flickered. It wasn't her anymore. She saw Grace, standing behind her, smiling a twisted, mournful smile. "You will join us," Grace's voice echoed in her mind, as the room around her seemed to melt away, consumed by the darkness. Ellie's scream was the last thing the village heard before the church fell silent once more. The next morning, the villagers found the doors to the church wide open, but inside, there was no trace of the friends, only the faint sound of wedding bells, lingering in the air, as if time had been frozen in that dreadful moment. And now, no one dares to go near the church after dark. The whispers grow louder each year, and the figure of the bride, with her hollow eyes and broken heart, still watches, waiting for the next souls to join her in the endless wedding she cannot escape. The villagers, once so used to the occasional whisper of the wind through the trees, had learned to live in uneasy silence since that night. They would cross the streets quickly, avoid eye contact, and speak in hushed tones whenever the subject of the church came up. But deep down, they all knew there was no escaping the truth. The ghosts of the wedding would never let them go. And as time passed, the stories began to change. Some claimed that Grace's ghost could be seen on foggy mornings, standing at the window of the church, staring out with those hollow eyes. Others spoke of strange lights flickering inside the church late at night, as if someone, or something, was still waiting for the wedding to finally take place. But the most terrifying stories came from those brave enough to venture too close. The few who dared go to the church after dark, to stand outside and see if the rumors were true, would often return with strange marks on their skin, scratches, burns, bruises. And they spoke of hearing voices, soft whispers, luring them closer, coaxing them into the church, promising them answers they could never understand. One evening, a new group of trespassers, foolish in their arrogance, arrived in the village. College students, full of bravado, decided to take on the legend head first. They had heard the stories, of course, but they were convinced it was all exaggerated, nothing more than drunken tales spun by the older generation. And so, they made their way to the church, equipped with cameras and flashlights, laughing at the idea of ghostly apparitions. As they approached the church, they felt it, the overwhelming sensation that something was wrong. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of years gone by. But they pushed on, determined to prove their skepticism. Inside, the dust was thick, and the floor creaked beneath their feet. The candles in the corners flickered, casting long, grotesque shadows on the walls. They set up their equipment, snapping photos and recording videos, the sounds of their laughter and chatter echoing through the cold stone. "Okay, let's do this," one of them, Mark, said, his voice mocking. "We're here, we've seen it, and we're leaving." But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut with such force that it rattled the entire church. Panic spread across the group as they rushed toward the exit, but the door wouldn't budge. No matter how hard they pushed, it was as if the very structure of the church had sealed them inside. The temperature plummeted, and the walls seemed to close in on them. Shadows danced in the corners of their vision, and the whispers began, soft at first, like a gentle breeze brushing against their ears, but then they grew louder and more distinct. "You shouldn't be here," a voice murmured. It wasn't a voice from a single person, it was a chorus of voices, layered upon one another, each one older, more tortured than the last. "Leave now, before it's too late." Mark laughed nervously, trying to dismiss the growing sense of dread. "It's just the wind, right? A little creaky building." But then, the whispering stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. A silence so profound, it felt as if the entire world had held its breath. Then, they saw her. Grace appeared at the altar, her face still obscured by dark, matted hair, her wedding dress ragged, stained. The room grew colder with each step she took toward them. And behind her, the shadowy figures of Thomas and the other lost souls followed, moving slowly, deliberately, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "No. No," Mark whispered, backing away. "Leave," Grace whispered, her voice thick with sorrow and rage. "Leave, or you will join us." Suddenly, the mirrors lining the church began to ripple. At first, it was almost imperceptible, a slight shift in the reflection. But then, the reflections began to distort, stretching and pulling at the edges like liquid. Faces began to appear in the mirrors, faces that were familiar to the trespassers. One of the students, Sarah, saw herself in the mirror, but her reflection wasn't smiling. It was twisted, with hollow eyes and a cruel grin, her mouth moving silently. She gasped, stumbling backward, her heart pounding. "This isn't real, this isn't real," she cried. But it was real. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of tortured souls calling to them, urging them to come closer. The figures of the bride and groom reached out their hands, their fingers clawing at the air. Then, something even more terrifying happened. One of the mirrors cracked, and out of it, a skeletal, decaying hand, reached through. It grasped Mark's arm with a strength that was unnatural, pulling him toward the glass. His scream echoed as his body was dragged into the mirror, the surface rippling around him like water. The others screamed, desperately trying to pull him back, but it was too late. Mark's face disappeared, leaving only an empty reflection, staring out at them with the same vacant, lifeless eyes they had seen in the figures. The room spun, and the remaining students fell to the ground, dizzy, disoriented. When they looked up again, the church was not the same. The walls had begun to close in, and the figures that had once been distant were now standing all around them, surrounding them in a circle of despair. "You are ours now," Grace's voice said, echoing in their minds. "Forever." Suddenly, they were no longer in the church at all. They stood on the edge of a dark, twisted version of the church, surrounded by endless darkness. The wedding bells tolled in the distance, their sound hollow, deafening. And then, one by one, they began to disappear. The last thing they heard was Grace's voice, soft and sad. "This is where we wait. For those who are foolish enough to believe that they can leave." The village was quiet once more. But the stories continued. The faces of those who dared enter the church began to fade from the minds of the villagers, becoming nothing more than whispered memories of youth and curiosity. The chilling tales of Grace and her twisted wedding were shared in hushed tones, like folklore passed down through generations. Yet, as time went on, something began to change. Something darker. It was just another cold night when Sarah, the last remaining survivor from the ill-fated group, arrived at the village. She had returned with the same resolve that had brought her there years ago. She had left in haste that night, terrified beyond reason, her mind forever scarred by the things she had seen. But now, after all the years, after all the therapy, the nightmares, and the pain, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unfinished. Something she had to know. The villagers greeted her with cold, distant eyes. They knew who she was, the one who survived, but no one spoke of the church. No one dared approach it, not after everything that had happened. They had tried to move on, pretending the past was a mere figment of their collective imagination. But Sarah wasn't here to forget. She was here to confront the curse that had trapped them all. "I have to go back," she told the bartender at the local inn. He just nodded grimly, a silent acknowledgement of the dangers she faced. "You've been warned," he muttered, sliding her a glass of water, his eyes darting nervously toward the window, as if expecting something, or someone, to appear. With a sigh, Sarah gathered her courage and stepped back onto the path leading to the church. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a sickly glow over the landscape, and the wind howled through the trees. It was the same as that fateful night, the same as the night her friends had disappeared. But she wasn't scared. At least not in the way she used to be. She had come to terms with the horrors of that night, and now she understood what had happened. She had to understand why the spirits had chosen them, why Grace and Thomas couldn't let go. And if there was a way to stop it, she would find it. As she approached the church, she noticed something new. The heavy doors were cracked open, just slightly, as though inviting her in. She hesitated for a moment, then pushed them open with a creak that reverberated through the air, setting her nerves on edge. The inside was darker than she remembered, the candles long since extinguished, the air heavy with dust. The echoes of her footsteps sounded like whispers in the silence, the walls seeming to breathe with her every movement. She could feel it, deep in her bones, the presence. Grace. Thomas. The lost souls. And then, she saw it, the mirror. It had been there the first time, too, but now it was different. It wasn't just cracked, It was shattered, the shards jagged and sharp, as though they had been torn apart by some unseen force. But as Sarah approached, the shards seemed to move, rearranging themselves, slowly forming the shape of a face she knew all too well. Grace. The image of the bride appeared in the mirror, her face distorted, her eyes hollow and empty. She reached out through the glass, her fingers brushing against Sarah's face with a cold, ghostly touch. Sarah recoiled, but the face in the mirror remained, its eyes staring at her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "Why are you here?" the voice whispered, not from the mirror, but from the very walls of the church. It was Grace's voice, but it was twisted, layered with the pain and anguish of all those trapped souls. "I'm here to help you," Sarah said, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. "I want to free you. I want to end this." The reflection of Grace smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was cruel, mocking. "You can't free us. We are bound here. We are part of this place. Forever." Sarah stepped back, her heart racing. She glanced around the church, as if searching for some kind of answer, something to break the curse. The room grew colder, the shadows stretching longer, and the whispers filled her ears again, louder now. And then, it happened. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the air grew thick with an unnatural pressure. The doors slammed shut once more, trapping her inside. She tried to pull them open, but they wouldn't budge. Panic began to set in as the room seemed to close in on her. The mirrors started to ripple again, like pools of water disturbed by an unseen force. Figures began to emerge from the glass, their faces distorted and twisted, their bodies long decayed. The lost souls of the church were coming to claim her. But Sarah refused to give in. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to turn back now. With trembling hands, she pulled a small, weathered book from her bag. It had been given to her years ago by an old woman in the village, a woman who had known the secrets of the church and the spirits that haunted it. The book was filled with ancient prayers, rituals designed to communicate with the dead, to banish them. Sarah didn't know if it would work, but it was the only chance she had. She opened the book, her hand shaking as she read the words aloud, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. The words seemed to vibrate in the air, their power undeniable. The spirits stopped moving. The shadows hesitated. And then, Grace appeared before her, standing tall in the center of the church, her face cold and unreadable. "You think you can free us?" Grace's voice was low and venomous. "You cannot undo what has been done." "I can try," Sarah said, her voice shaking but determined. "You're not trapped here forever. You're not." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the ground trembled again, and a blinding light exploded from the mirror, filling the room with a brightness so intense it burned her eyes. When the light faded, Sarah was alone. The church was still. The whispers were gone. The door stood open, and outside, the moon was high in the sky, shining brighter than ever before. But as Sarah stepped into the night, a strange feeling washed over her, a feeling that she was being watched. Slowly, she turned, her eyes scanning the empty church. In the distance, just at the edge of the shadows, she thought she saw something. A figure. Grace? But it was gone before she could be sure. The curse had lifted. Or had it? Sarah walked away from the church, her heart still pounding in her chest. The air around her felt clearer, lighter than it had in years. The oppressive darkness that had once filled the village seemed to lift, and the oppressive weight in her chest started to ease. It was as though she had lifted a curse that had not just hung over the church, but over the entire village, and perhaps even over herself. But something lingered in the back of her mind. The figure she had seen at the edge of the shadows. Was it Grace? Was it something else? The thought that the curse might not truly be broken gnawed at her. Despite the lightness she felt in her steps, there was a growing unease that she couldn't shake. As she made her way down the dirt road, she noticed that the village was eerily quiet. Not a single person stirred. There were no sounds of life, no children playing, no dogs barking, not even the rustle of wind through the trees. It was as though the village had been abandoned. In the distance, she saw the old inn where she had stayed. The lights were dimmed, and the door was slightly ajar, as if waiting for her. A sense of foreboding crept up her spine, but Sarah couldn't ignore the pull, the feeling that she needed to go back, to make sure it was truly over. When she pushed the door open, she was met with silence. The bartender, the one who had warned her earlier, was nowhere to be found. The tables were empty, the fire in the hearth long extinguished. There was a faint smell in the air, like dust, like time that stood still here for longer than it should have. "Hello?" Sarah called out, her voice echoing in the empty space. But there was no answer. She walked further inside, her footsteps the only sound in the oppressive quiet. And then, she saw it, a small piece of paper, lying on the counter. She picked it up, her hands trembling as she read the hastily written message. "The curse is never broken. It is only delayed. You will see them again. They are never truly gone." A chill ran down her spine. She turned, expecting to find someone behind her. But there was nothing. Only the shadows, stretching longer, reaching toward her. "Is someone here?" she asked again, but the words seemed to hang in the air, unanswered. Then, just as she was about to leave, she heard it. The faintest sound, like the rustle of fabric. The softest whisper of a voice. "Sarah." Her heart skipped a beat, and she spun around, searching for the source. The room was empty. No one was there. But the whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. "Sarah, come back." Her breath caught in her throat. The voice was unmistakable. It was Grace's voice. Without thinking, Sarah rushed toward the door, her pulse racing. She had to get out of there. She had to leave before whatever was happening consumed her once again. But as she stepped out into the street, the village had changed. The buildings looked different, darker, more decayed. The once quiet streets were now crowded with people, though their faces were all wrong. They looked like shadows. Silhouettes of those who had lived here, but with no life behind their eyes. Their mouths moved, but no sound came out. Their eyes followed Sarah as she walked, empty and unblinking. And in the distance, she saw the church again, though it was no longer the crumbling ruin she had left behind. It stood tall, imposing, as though time itself had rewound. The doors were open, and standing in the doorway was a figure, a woman in a tattered wedding dress, her face obscured. Sarah's heart raced. She knew, without a doubt, that it was Grace. "Why can't you leave me alone?" Sarah whispered, taking a step backward. But Grace didn't answer. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed toward Sarah, the gesture slow and deliberate, as though marking her. The shadows that had been standing still now moved toward Sarah, their faces contorting, their hands reaching out to grab her. Sarah turned to run, but the shadows swarmed her, pulling her toward the church. No matter how hard she struggled, she couldn't break free. The cold hands tightened around her, dragging her toward the door. "Let me go!" Sarah screamed, her voice hoarse with terror. But the shadows were relentless. They dragged her into the church, and as the doors slammed shut behind her, the light from the outside world disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. Inside, the church had changed again. The walls were covered in cracks, the floor was rotting, and the air was thick with dust. The mirrors were gone, replaced by strange symbols drawn on the walls, pulsating with a dark, unnatural energy. Grace stood at the altar, her eyes glowing faintly, her mouth twisted into a cruel smile. "You thought you could break the curse," she said, her voice echoing in the empty church. "You thought you could free us." Sarah's heart sank as she realized the truth. The curse hadn't been broken. It had been passed on. And now, she was trapped, just like the others. "I was wrong," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. I thought it was over." "It's never over," Grace replied, her smile widening. "The wedding is eternal. And now, you are part of it." With a final, terrifying scream, the shadows closed in on Sarah, pulling her into the darkness. The village had all but forgotten about the church, or so it seemed. Time, as it always does, moved forward. People came and went, and the past was buried beneath layers of history and rumor. But in the depths of the night, when the wind howled through the trees and the moon hung heavy in the sky, the church remained, a silent sentinel of secrets that would never truly die. Years passed, and the village grew quieter. Few ventured near the old church anymore, but a new generation of thrill-seekers began to whisper about the place. The legends of Grace and Thomas, the tragic bride and groom, were reborn as curiosity turned into an attraction. And so, another group of young souls, ignorant of the horrors that lay ahead, decided to challenge the ancient spirits. 4 friends, Lily, Alex, Jake, and Emma, stood at the edge of the village, looking up at the church. The building loomed tall against the night sky, its silhouette like a shadow stretching across the land. To them, it was nothing more than a haunted landmark, a place to visit for the thrill of it. "This is it, guys," Alex said, grinning. "Let's see if we can't get a picture with the ghost of the bride. You know, the one everyone talks about." "Are you sure about this?" Lily asked, her voice betraying a flicker of doubt. "I've heard stories, you know." Emma rolled her eyes. "Stories? Come on, Lily, you're not afraid, are you? We're just going to take some pictures, have a laugh, and get out of here." "No big deal." Jake nodded, his phone already in hand. "Exactly. Let's do this. It's just another urban legend." With no more hesitation, the group marched toward the church, unaware that they were walking straight into the grasp of something far more real than any legend. The doors creaked open with an unsettling groan, as if the church had been waiting for them, patient and hungry. They stepped inside, their flashlights sweeping through the vast, empty space. The air was stale and cold, thick with the scent of rot, and the silence was heavy, pressing against their ears. "This place is creepy as hell," Jake said, his voice a little less confident now. He turned on his camera and snapped a photo of the altar. But as the flash went off, something strange happened. For a split second, the light flickered, casting the church in shadow. When it came back on, there was a figure at the far end of the aisle, standing near the altar. It was a woman in a wedding dress. "Holy shit!" Alex shouted, stumbling backward, his eyes wide in disbelief. "Did you see that?" The others spun around, but the woman in the wedding dress was gone. "What the hell?" Lily muttered, looking nervously at the others. "I swear I saw her. Just standing there, right before the altar." Okay, this is weird," Emma said, trying to laugh it off. But her voice wavered. Let's just take our pictures and leave. They moved further into the church, all of them uneasy now. They snapped more photos, each one revealing only shadows, distorted shapes, and something just out of sight that they couldn't quite capture on film. The further they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air grew colder, thicker. And then they heard it, the faintest sound, like the distant ringing of a bell. Slow. Steady. Unyielding. Is anyone else hearing that? Lily asked, her eyes darting around the room. It's just the wind, or something, Alex said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. The bell rang again. It was louder this time, almost as if it were coming from inside the church itself. They froze, unsure of what to do, the sound growing more distinct, more haunting. And then, without warning, the doors slammed shut behind them, making them jump in unison. Shit! We need to get out of here, Jake said, his voice panicked. He rushed toward the doors, but when he tried to pull them open, they didn't budge. They were locked. This isn't funny anymore, Lily said, her voice trembling. We need to leave. Now. But as they turned to run, they saw it. The figure of the bride, standing in the doorway of the altar, staring at them with cold, empty eyes. Her wedding dress was tattered, her hair disheveled, her skin pale as bone. And behind her, a shadow moved. It was long, stretched, like the shadow of something far larger, something far darker. The room seemed to grow darker still, the shadows stretching toward them, filling the corners of the church. Who are you? Emma asked, her voice a whisper of fear. The bride didn't answer. Instead, she raised a hand and pointed toward them. Her fingers were long, twisted, and skeletal. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The shadows around them began to grow, the darkness swirling into shapes, human shapes, faces that flickered like candles, hollow eyes staring with empty malice. They've come, a voice said, deep and hollow. It wasn't just Grace's voice, but a chorus of voices, whispers from every corner of the church. You're too late. You've entered our wedding. The figures in the shadows stepped closer, their footsteps heavy, deliberate. No! We have to go now. Alex shouted, trying to force the doors open again, but it was futile. The shadows were closing in, their forms now solid and unmistakable, pale, decayed figures, their mouths opened in silent screams. The bell tolled again, louder now, and it was no longer just one bell. It was a chorus of bells, ringing in perfect unison, vibrating the walls. The friends backed away, but they were surrounded. There was no escape. And then, as the first figure reached out to grab Lily's arm, everything went dark. When the villagers woke the next morning, they found the church doors open again, just as they had been so many years before. The air was still, and the sun rose above the horizon, casting a golden light over the village. But as the people walked past the church, they noticed something strange. There were no sounds coming from inside. No footsteps. No whispers. Nothing. And when they looked inside, they saw only empty pews, the altar bare. The mirrors, once shattered, were gone. But the shadows remained. The curse had claimed 4 more souls, and now, the whispers would never stop. The wedding, it seemed, had only just begun. The village remained unchanged on the surface, life carrying on as it always had. But beneath the calm exterior, something had shifted. The old church, once again open to the elements, now seemed more alive than ever. It stood at the heart of the village, as though waiting for the next souls to wander into its grasp. Weeks passed, but no one spoke openly of what had happened to the group of four. The village had its unspoken rules, its dark secrets, and it was best to ignore the cursed place that had claimed so many lives. The stories of Grace and Thomas, once mere whispers, now grew louder, more persistent, reaching the ears of the curious and the foolish alike. And so, it was inevitable that another group would come, drawn by the legends, the stories, and the hope that they could face what had defeated so many before them. Three friends, Tom, Carla, and Sam, stood before the church one chilly evening. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the ground. They had heard the stories, yes, but they were hardened skeptics, dismissing them as nothing more than exaggerations. Tom, the leader of the group, was a self-proclaimed ghost hunter. He had ventured into countless abandoned places, always coming out unscathed. To him, this was just another stop on his growing list of paranormal investigations. "I'm telling you, this place is a gold mine," Tom said, a grin on his face as he scanned the old church. "The history here, the tragedy, it's perfect. We're going to get footage no one else has." "The ghost of the bride?" "That's exactly what people want to see." Carla rolled her eyes. "You're obsessed with this stuff, you know that, right?" "I just want to prove it's all fake," Tom shot back, already walking toward the entrance. "Let's get in, get some footage, and get out before anyone notices." Sam, who was quieter than the others, glanced around uneasily. "Are you sure about this?" "I've heard things, about people disappearing, about the village being cursed." "Cursed, haunted, whatever. It's just a story." "You guys are freaking out over nothing," Tom said, pushing open the creaky doors. "Come on." Reluctantly, Carla and Sam followed him inside. The church was just as they expected, dusty, dark, and decaying. The smell of mildew filled the air, and the creaking of the old building seemed to follow them as they moved. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing faded stained glass windows and broken pews. The altar, still standing at the far end of the room, looked as if it hadn't been touched in years. But there was something different this time. The air felt thick, charged with an energy they couldn't explain. And when the door slammed shut behind them, it wasn't the wind. Sam's heart raced as he turned to Tom. "Okay, this is getting weird. We should leave." But Tom was already walking toward the altar, filming with his camera. "We're not leaving without proof. If you want to bail, go ahead, but I'm getting the footage." Carla exchanged an uneasy glance with Sam. "Fine," she muttered, "but I'm not staying long." As they ventured deeper into the church, the temperature seemed to drop. The air grew heavy, suffocating. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, flickering in and out of their vision. Suddenly, Tom stopped filming, his face going pale. "Did you hear that?" They listened. A faint whisper, too soft to understand, echoed through the church. It was distant, but unmistakable. "Did anyone else hear that?" Carla asked, her voice wavering. "It's probably just the wind," Tom said, but there was a hint of doubt in his voice. The whisper grew louder. Then, another sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like the sound of a wedding bell, but distant, reverberating through the walls of the church. It was low at first, but the closer they moved toward the altar, the louder it became. "Okay, I'm done," Carla said, her voice trembling. "We need to go. Now." But Tom was already advancing further, his camera still rolling. "It's just a sound. We're here to investigate, not run away." Sam grabbed Carla's arm, pulling her toward the exit. "Tom, stop. Let's leave before we get trapped in here like the others." But it was too late. As they turned toward the door, they froze. A figure stood at the entrance of the aisle, its form barely visible in the dim light. It was a woman in a tattered wedding dress, her back turned to them. Her long, matted hair covered her face, but the sound of the bells grew louder, closer. "Grace," Carla whispered, her eyes wide with terror. The woman in the wedding dress turned slowly, her face hidden by the tangled hair. But as she faced them, the temperature dropped even further. The bell tolled again, but this time, it wasn't just one bell, it was as if the entire church was ringing in unison, the sound deafening. "No, no, this can't be happening," Sam whispered. The bride's mouth parted, but the words were not hers. They were voices, voices that came from everywhere, from all around them. "You shouldn't have come. You can never leave." The doors slammed shut again with a resounding crash, trapping them inside. Panic set in as the shadows began to stretch toward them, becoming tangible, reaching hands that seemed to claw at the air. Tom screamed, backing away, but the church was no longer the building they had entered. The walls seemed to pulse, closing in, as the darkness filled the room, suffocating them. The air thickened, and the whispers turned into shrieks of agony, voices pleading for release, for someone to hear them. Carla tried to pull Tom toward the exit, but the darkness was too strong. The shadows reached out, wrapping around them like cold fingers. "You will never leave this place," the voice of Grace echoed, now layered with dozens of other voices. "You are part of the wedding now." The last thing Sam saw was the bride's face, her eyes hollow, her smile twisted with the pain of 1,000 lost souls. And then, everything went black. The next morning, the villagers once again found the church doors open, as though inviting them in. But there were no screams, no sounds of struggle. Only silence. And on the floor of the church, scattered about like forgotten relics, were Tom's camera, Carla's phone, and Sam's watch, remnants of the group that had wandered too far into the heart of darkness. The whispers, however, never stopped. They continued to echo through the village, and as the moon rose high in the sky, the church waited, as it always had, for the next souls foolish enough to enter its doors. The village had long since learned to ignore the church. They would walk past it with averted eyes, keep their children far away, and whisper stories among themselves in hushed tones. It was an unspoken rule, never speak of the church. Never look too closely at it. Because once you acknowledged it, it was watching you, waiting for the right moment to strike. But, as with all things, time had a way of dulling memories. The younger generations, those who had never seen the horrors firsthand, had begun to forget. They heard the tales from their parents and grandparents, of Grace and Thomas, the lost souls, the dark shadows that haunted the church. But these were just stories, nothing more. Ghosts couldn't hurt you, right? That was until they came. Lena and Josh, a couple in their early 20s, had recently moved to the village. The quiet, isolated atmosphere was exactly what they'd been looking for after leaving the bustle of the city. They had heard the stories, of course, but like many before them, they dismissed them as mere superstition. People liked their ghost stories, especially in small towns. What could possibly go wrong? But when they stumbled upon the church one evening, something was different. It had been a long, peaceful walk through the woods, the sun setting behind them as they made their way toward the village. Lena had wanted to take a shortcut back, and Josh, ever the adventurer, had agreed. They had been walking for a while when the church came into view. It stood tall in the distance, the spire of its steeple piercing the sky, but there was something unsettling about it. Its windows, cracked and clouded, seemed to watch them. The doors, though shut, felt almost inviting. "I've heard about this place," Lena said. her voice tentative. I mean, it's one of those creepy old buildings everyone talks about. Josh laughed, brushing a strand of hair from his face. Just some old ruins, probably. Let's take a look. Who knows? Maybe we'll get a cool picture for Instagram. They approached the church, the air growing cooler with each step. When they reached the front, Josh pushed open the door, which creaked loudly as it opened. Lena hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her. Inside, the church was exactly as they had imagined, a forgotten relic of the past. Dust covered the pews, the altar was untouched, and the air was thick with age. The scent of mold and decay hung heavily, but there was a strange energy in the room, an eerie stillness that made Lena uneasy. She glanced around, her eyes falling on the broken stained glass windows and the cracked mirror by the altar. I don't like it in here, she said softly. Let's just grab a quick photo and go. But Josh wasn't listening. He was already making his way toward the altar, his camera raised in front of him. Come on, Lena. It's fine. I just want to get some good shots for the blog. Lena reluctantly followed him, but the air seemed to grow colder as they ventured deeper into the church. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, stretching and flickering. It felt as though something was watching them, waiting. Then, the bell rang. It was a soft sound at first, almost like it was coming from far away. But the tone was unmistakable, a low, mournful toll that resonated through the walls of the church. Josh froze, his camera still raised, as the bell tolled again. The sound was louder now, closer. Is that a real bell? Lena whispered, her voice tense. Before Josh could respond, the temperature in the church dropped sharply. Lena's breath turned to mist in the air, and her hands began to shake uncontrollably. A dark figure appeared in the doorway at the far end of the church, the flickering light from their flashlights revealing the silhouette of a woman, dressed in tattered white, her long, dark hair falling over her face. Lena's heart skipped a beat. Josh, we need to leave. Now. But Josh didn't seem to hear her. His eyes were wide, fixed on the woman at the doorway. He stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper. Lena, look. The woman didn't move. She simply stood there, her face hidden in shadow, her presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. The bell tolled once more, louder now, shaking the walls around them. The woman slowly raised her head, her eyes glowing with a sickly, otherworldly light. When she spoke, her voice was a soft, haunting whisper, but it seemed to echo from every corner of the church. You shouldn't have come. Lena's blood ran cold. She grabbed Josh's arm, pulling him back toward the door, but the shadows around them seemed to thicken, closing in. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash. No! Lena screamed, but the sound of her voice was swallowed by the growing chaos in the church. The figure at the doorway began to move toward them, her steps slow and deliberate, the bells ringing louder, faster. Leave, the voice echoed. You're not welcome here. Josh tried to push against the door, but it wouldn't budge. The walls around them began to pulse, and the shadows seemed to breathe, reaching out to grab them. The woman was closer now, her face finally revealed, a twisted, decayed version of a bride, her eyes hollow and empty. The smile on her face was cruel, mocking. Suddenly, there was a low growl, a sound that reverberated through the ground beneath their feet. The church trembled, and the air seemed to vibrate with dark energy. A series of mirrors lining the walls shattered all at once, and from the shards, more figures began to emerge, ghostly brides and grooms, their faces blank and soulless, their hands reaching for the couple. Josh, help! Lena screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the cacophony of whispers. The figures were closing in, their hollow eyes staring at them, as if they were trapped in an endless cycle of agony. With a final burst of desperation, Lena grabbed Josh's arm and pulled him toward the altar. "We have to make it out of here. We have to break the curse." But as they reached the altar, the floor beneath them cracked open, and the darkness swallowed them whole. The village remained silent the next morning. The church doors stood open once again, as they always did. But when the villagers went inside, there was no sign of Lena and Josh. Only the remnants of their belongings, Josh's camera, Lena's phone, were left behind, scattered across the altar. The bell tolled once more, echoing through the empty church, as if it had never stopped. The whispers would never cease. The souls would never rest. And the church, as it always had, waited. The village never fully recovered from the last visit to the church. People continued to speak in whispers, though their voices were low and guarded, as if even acknowledging the church would make it real. The tales of Grace and Thomas, of the bride and the lost souls, had turned from warnings into legends, and now no one dared go near the place. The church had become a forbidden part of the landscape, a shadow lurking in the corner of their lives, always watching, always waiting. But there was one more chapter to this story. One final visit, one final soul to pay the price. It was an unusually cold winter morning when the news spread through the village. The church doors were open again, just as they had always been, standing wide for anyone who dared enter. And this time, it wasn't a young thrill-seeker or a curious traveler, it was someone who knew better. Someone who had heard the stories, had seen the horror firsthand, and had returned, despite everything. It was Sarah. The woman who had fought to end the curse, the one who had tried to break the cycle. She had left the village years ago, shaken, scarred, but determined. Yet, in the years that followed, something within her had never settled. A gnawing feeling, a pull that she couldn't explain, had led her back here. She arrived at the church alone, her breath misting in the air, the village eerily quiet behind her. The church stood before her, no longer just a structure, it was a living thing, waiting for her to step inside. She had to end it. She had to know the truth. When Sarah pushed open the church doors, the bell tolled, just as it always did. The sound echoed through the empty room, a warning, a reminder. The air inside was heavy with the same suffocating chill she remembered, the same stagnant smell of decay. But she wasn't afraid. She had faced the horrors before. She knew what awaited her. The silence was deafening. And then, just as it had before, the figure appeared, the woman in the wedding dress. Grace. But this time, Sarah wasn't shocked. She wasn't even afraid. She looked directly at the ghost, her eyes filled with sorrow and determination. "It's time," Sarah whispered. Grace tilted her head, a slow, eerie smile spreading across her face. Her eyes were empty, but somehow they gleamed with recognition. She had been waiting for this moment. "You think you can stop this?" Grace's voice was like the wind, cold and distant, but filled with a strange power. "You think you can free us?" Sarah stepped forward, unflinching. "I've seen enough. You've seen enough. It doesn't have to be like this. You don't have to keep this curse alive." The shadows in the room stirred, whispering. The spirits of the lost souls, the brides and grooms, all of them. They gathered around her, moving like smoke, their faces twisted in sorrow and rage. They were all there, waiting for Sarah to make her move. "This place feeds on pain," Sarah said softly. "On fear. On unfinished promises." Grace's smile faded. And yet, here you are, standing in the very place you swore to leave behind. This place is in you, Sarah. You will never escape. I'm not running anymore, Sarah replied. I've lived with the weight of your pain for too long. It's time to let you go. The bell rang again, louder this time, shaking the walls. The floor beneath Sarah trembled, but she stood firm, her eyes locked on Grace. You can't break it. You can't undo what's been done, Grace hissed, her voice growing louder, more frantic. We are eternal. This wedding will never end. But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She reached into her bag and pulled out the same worn, tattered book, the one the old woman in the village had given her all those years ago. The book of prayers, of rituals meant to banish the dead. The book that held the key. With steady hands, Sarah opened it to the page she knew by heart. The ancient words written on the page seemed to glow with a faint light, and as she began to speak, the very air around her seemed to pulse. You are not forgotten, Sarah chanted, her voice steady but filled with the weight of everything she had learned. You are not bound to this place. You are free. You are released. The shadows recoiled, as though they couldn't bear the light. The temperature dropped even further, and the spirits screamed, their wails growing louder, mixing with the ringing of the bell, until the sound became unbearable. Grace's form flickered, wavering as if caught between two worlds. No, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. You cannot take this from us. But Sarah didn't stop. The words flowed from her, the power of them filling the church, pushing back the darkness that had held it captive for so long. And then, with one final, resounding cry, the darkness shattered. The bell stopped ringing. The shadows faded. And the church, which had once been a prison for the lost, was silent. For the first time in as long as Sarah could remember, there was no whispering, no echoes of ghosts. The church was empty. The air was still. And the weight that had been in her chest for years had finally lifted. But as she turned to leave, a small flicker of movement caught her eye. There, in the shattered mirror by the altar, she saw it, Grace, standing there, her face calm, her eyes now full of peace. Thank you, the ghost whispered. And then, just like that, she was gone. Sarah took a deep breath, the air now clear, the weight of the curse finally gone. The church, now empty of its tortured souls, was nothing more than a ruin. A place that had once held so much darkness now stood silent, waiting for the sun to rise. And as Sarah stepped out into the light, the village seemed different. The world seemed different. For the first time, there was hope. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Horror Echo. Let us know if you've ever had a similar experience. We'd love to hear your story. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.